A meticulous employee becomes the target of a boss driven by insecurity and ambition. Fired on a flimsy excuse, his name erased from the company's triumphs, the boss believes he secured his control. But the lies, the sabotage, the humiliation, it's all about to unravel. What the boss doesn't know is that the one he cast aside holds the key to a devastating truth. In a room full of powerful eyes, justice will be served cold. Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any inspiring stories. The polished glass exterior of Arctic Nova's corporate headquarters gleamed under the morning sun, a towering monument to innovation in the frozen food industry. Inside, the marketing and R&D department buzzed with activity. Polished floors reflected the energy of employees rushing between brainstorming sessions and high-stakes meetings. Large screens on the walls cycled through promotional videos showcasing Arctic Nova's luxury product line, each item designed to blend convenience with indulgence. A tagline played on loop: "Frozen, not forgotten." Arctic Nova delivers excellence at its core. The office exuded sleek professionalism, but beneath its surface lay a tightly wound culture of competition. Here, results were everything, and failure was not tolerated. For Franklin Yones, the newest hire in the R&D department, this environment was nothing new. He had worked his way up in high-pressure internships, carving out a reputation as meticulous and unshakably professional. Franklin sat at his desk, his fingers deftly navigating through intricate data models on his laptop. His workspace was as orderly as his mind, stacks of neatly labeled reports, a leather-bound notebook brimming with ideas, and a company-issued mug with faint coffee stains on the rim. His sharp suit and calm demeanor made him stand out, though it was his precision and work ethic that had truly begun to turn heads. "Frank, can you take a look at this?" The voice belonged to Samantha Spencer, one of the marketing department's rising stars. Samantha was the kind of person who turned heads wherever she went, not just for her striking golden hair or her poised presence, but for the genuine warmth in her demeanor. Franklin looked up, his gaze meeting hers as she held out a draft proposal. "Sure, Mantha," he said, flashing a small grin. Samantha rolled her eyes playfully at the nickname, but she appreciated his thoughtful critiques. "You're the only one who'll tell me if this storage guide makes sense." Franklin's eyes scanned the document, and he nodded. "Solid, but you might want to clarify the freezing range here. Customers need absolute clarity." Before Samantha could thank him, a shadow fell across the desk. "Franklin." The voice was clipped, controlled, and unmistakably Mr. Kim's. Franklin straightened instinctively. Mr. Kim stood over them, his sharp gaze fixed like a laser on the two of them. His tailored suit and spotless shoes reflected his obsession with order and control. "Do you think this is a social hour?" Mr. Kim asked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Without waiting for an answer, he added, "There's a meeting in 10 minutes. Be there." He turned on his heel and strode back toward his glass-walled office, his polished shoes echoing ominously on the sleek floor. Employees nearby lowered their voices, carefully avoiding his gaze. For most, Mr. Kim's presence was an enigma. Nobody knew his first name. He insisted on being addressed only as Mr. Kim, a nod to his belief in rigid professionalism. To him, familiarity undermined authority, and authority was everything. But his strict adherence to hierarchy often veered into hypocrisy. For example, while he insisted everyone address Samantha formally as Miss Spencer, he frequently referred to her as Sammy, a nickname laced with condescension. "Does he ever relax?" Franklin murmured after Mr. Kim disappeared. Samantha chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Not in this lifetime. But try not to let him get to you. He's always like this." Franklin had only been with Arctic Nova for a few months, but it was clear that Mr. Kim viewed him as a threat. His meticulousness, his ease under pressure, and even his growing camaraderie with Samantha, all of it seemed to provoke the older man. From his office, Mr. Kim watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He took a sip of coffee, his grip tightening on the handle of the cup. To him, Franklin represented everything that was wrong with the younger generation: casual, informal, and too confident for his own good. "Let's see how sharp he really is under pressure," Mr. Kim muttered to himself, his gaze shifting to his computer screen. An email invitation to an impromptu meeting with the department's coordinator popped up on his desktop. As the meeting time neared, Franklin gathered his materials, unaware that the day's events would set in motion a chain of escalating tensions. He glanced at Samantha, who gave him a quick thumbs up before returning to her own work. "Thanks, Mantha," he said, earning a quick smile in response. But not everyone was smiling. From behind his glass walls, Mr. Kim's lips curled into a thin, unreadable line. His mind churned with plans, calculating every move. For him, Arctic Nova wasn't just a workplace, it was his domain. And Franklin Yones, with his quiet confidence and disarming charm, was an intruder who needed to be put in his place. The polished conference table in Arctic Nova's R&D wing gleamed under the overhead lights, surrounded by the department's senior staff. Mr. Kim sat at the head, his posture as rigid as his work ethic. He didn't smile as the meeting began, his sharp eyes scanning the room for any sign of weakness. At the far end of the table, Franklin Yones clicked through slides on a large monitor. His voice was calm and steady, walking the team through his proposal for Arctic Nova's next groundbreaking product, a luxury frozen meal designed to outshine competitors in both taste and convenience. This product offers clear benefits for consumers, Franklin explained, clicking to a chart showing detailed storage conditions. The optimal freezing range ensures long-lasting quality, and our testing confirms a 6-month shelf life without compromising safety. The data was precise, the visuals compelling. Even the skeptical murmurs of the senior staff quieted as Franklin outlined his work. "This is excellent," said Mr. Hartman, the department coordinator. He tapped his pen on the table, nodding in approval. "One of the most thorough proposals I've seen. It's ready for the investors." Franklin thanked him with a polite nod, but his confidence was short-lived. Across the room, Mr. Kim's expression hardened. He hadn't said a word, but his sharp gaze was a storm brewing in silence. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Hartman motioned to Franklin. "Could you hand me a hard copy of the draft? I'd like to review it before the investor event." Franklin passed him the folder without hesitation. Of course. It was a small routine action, but as Mr. Kim's eyes followed the exchange, his jaw tightened. He stood abruptly. "Yones." The room fell silent. Franklin turned to face him. "That's not how we do things here," Mr. Kim said, his voice icy. "Where I come from, we respect hierarchy. You don't bypass your manager. Everything goes through me first." Franklin met his gaze evenly. The coordinator requested it directly. "I thought it best to provide it without delay." Mr. Kim's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You thought wrong." The tension in the room was palpable as the team awkwardly shuffled their notes, eager to escape the brewing conflict. Back in his office, Mr. Kim reviewed Franklin's proposal in icy silence. The polished draft was airtight, its details meticulously researched and backed by thorough testing. It was everything the company could want in a new product. And yet, that was precisely the problem. Mr. Kim leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he contemplated his next move. Franklin was too good, too meticulous, too unflappable. His work spoke for itself, and it undermined Mr. Kim's authority every time someone noticed. He stared at the draft for a long moment before opening the file on his computer and making changes. Small at first, vague wording in the storage instructions, less emphasis on precision. Then he went further, inflating the shelf life to 12 months, a number that sounded bold but hadn't been tested. By the time he was done, the proposal was still impressive, but it was also a lie. The next morning, Franklin arrived at his desk to find an email from Mr. Kim summoning him to a meeting. The subject line was simple and direct: performance review. Franklin entered Mr. Kim's office, his composure steady despite the pointed glare waiting for him. "You've been here long enough to know how things work," Mr. Kim began without preamble. "Yet you've repeatedly disregarded protocol." Franklin furrowed his brow. "I've followed every directive given to me." "You handed the proposal to the coordinator without my approval," Mr. Kim snapped. "That's insubordination." Franklin's jaw tightened, but he held his tone level. "The coordinator requested it directly, and I delivered." Mr. Kim leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "You don't seem to understand how this company works. I don't tolerate insubordination." He paused for effect before delivering the final blow. "You're fired." The words hung in the air like a death knell. Franklin's hands clenched slightly at his sides, but he kept his expression neutral. "Understood," he said quietly. Rising from his seat, he gathered his things and left without another word. As the door closed behind him, Mr. Kim leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. But his victory was short-lived. With Franklin gone, Mr. Kim took full credit for the product proposal. He adjusted the slides for the investor pitch, emphasizing the 12-month shelf life and avoiding any mention of the rigorous 6-month testing data Franklin had meticulously compiled. The upcoming investor presentation was his chance to shine, and he intended to milk it for all it was worth. In the days leading up to the event, Mr. Kim rehearsed his pitch, polishing every word to perfection. Samantha, meanwhile, grew increasingly uneasy. Her role in the event had been reduced to standing beside Mr. Kim and holding the product prototype, a demeaning reduction that left her seething quietly. On the day of the presentation, Samantha found herself alone with Mr. Kim in the green room. He adjusted his tie while she clutched the prototype box, her knuckles white against the smooth surface. "You look perfect, Sammy," he said without looking at her. "Just smile and let me do the talking." It was the final straw. Samantha didn't respond, but the fire in her eyes said enough. Mr. Kim didn't notice. He was too busy rehearsing his big moment. The conference hall at Arctic Nova's headquarters was transformed into a theater of luxury and innovation. Investors filled the rows of sleek white chairs arranged before a brightly lit stage. Behind the podium stood a massive screen, displaying Arctic Nova's logo, a glistening blue snowflake wrapped in silver curves. It radiated opulence, a testament to the company's dominance in the frozen food industry. Mr. Kim stood behind the stage curtain, adjusting his tie for the third time. The air buzzed with anticipation, but his mind was focused on one thing: perfection. Everything about today had to be flawless, from his tailored suit to the pitch he had rehearsed a dozen times. He would show the investors, and Arctic Nova's leadership, that he was the visionary the company needed. Beside him, Samantha Spencer held the prototype box for the new product. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the sleek package, her frustration masked by the professional smile she wore like armor. Mr. Kim glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You look perfect, Sammy," he said, his tone condescending. "Just hold that and let me do the talking." She didn't respond, but a subtle tightening of her jaw betrayed her growing anger. She thought of all the late nights she had spent fine-tuning the marketing strategy for this product, only to be reduced to a prop. The stage manager signaled that it was time. Mr. Kim stepped onto the stage to a smattering of applause, his presence commanding. Samantha followed, clutching the box as though it were her shield. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Kim began, his voice smooth and calculated, "welcome to the future of frozen cuisine." The screen behind him lit up with a dramatic image of the product, a luxurious frozen meal plated on fine china, framed by glowing blue light. The words "revolutionary shelf life" appeared in bold beneath it. "This product," he continued, "is not just food, it's an experience. It combines convenience, taste, and innovation in a way no competitor can match. And let me tell you why." The audience leaned forward as Mr. Kim launched into his pitch. Slide after slide showcased the product's supposed features. Adaptability. The product can be stored under any freezing conditions without losing its quality. Extended shelf life. With our cutting-edge preservation techniques, it remains fresh for an unprecedented 12 months. The investors murmured in approval at first. The claims were bold, exactly the kind of disruption they wanted to see in the market. But as Mr. Kim's presentation continued, the questions began. A hand shot up in the front row. It belonged to one of Arctic Nova's longtime investors, a stern-faced woman with a reputation for thoroughness. "Mr. Kim," she said, her voice cutting through the room, "these storage claims, what specific freezing conditions were tested to validate them?" Mr. Kim smiled tightly. "Our advanced proprietary technology ensures safety across all freezing conditions." Another hand rose. This time, it was a younger investor, clearly intrigued but wary. "A 12-month shelf life is unheard of in this industry. Can you elaborate on the testing process for this?" Mr. Kim hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Samantha to notice. He recovered quickly, his voice smooth but evasive. "Our team conducted rigorous in-house testing, and the results speak for themselves," he said. In the back row, a few investors exchanged skeptical glances. One by one, questions began to pile up, their pointed nature breaking through Mr. Kim's polished veneer. "How do you account for safety during transport with such vague storage guidelines? What about independent testing? Was this verified by a third party?" Each question seemed to chip away at the illusion Mr. Kim had so carefully constructed. His answers grew shorter, more defensive. "Everything has been accounted for," he snapped at one point, his frustration slipping through his polished facade. From her place beside him, Samantha's discomfort turned into outright anger. Her mind raced with the details of the original draft, the specific freezing temperatures, the rigorous 6-month testing, all replaced with vague exaggerations. Her eyes scanned the audience. Investors in the front row began gathering their belongings, their movements subtle but deliberate. A few murmured to one another, clearly unimpressed. Samantha stepped forward. It was unplanned, but she couldn't watch the presentation spiral any further. She shifted the prototype box to one arm and raised her free hand slightly, signaling the room to quiet down. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm but firm, "thank you for your attention today. I understand you have a lot of questions, and they deserve accurate, thorough answers." Mr. Kim turned to her, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. "Sammy, this isn't." She cut him off with a polite but pointed smile. "Please rest assured that Arctic Nova is committed to transparency. We will provide detailed follow-ups to all of your concerns in the coming days." Her professionalism struck a chord with the audience. The murmurs of discontent quieted, replaced by nods of approval. Investors who had been preparing to leave paused, curious to see how this would unfold. "Thank you for your time," Samantha concluded, stepping back. The applause that followed was polite but subdued, the tension in the room still palpable. Backstage, the air was heavy with unspoken words. Mr. Kim rounded on Samantha the moment they were alone, his voice low and furious. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. Samantha placed the prototype box on a nearby table, her posture calm but unyielding. "It was damage control," she said simply. "You embarrassed me," Mr. Kim snarled. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I did what was necessary," she replied, her voice steady. "If you won't be honest, someone has to." Their confrontation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A stagehand stepped in, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Kim," the stagehand said nervously, "the CEO just arrived. He'd like to see you and the rest of the team in his office first thing tomorrow morning." Samantha met Mr. Kim's glare with a steady gaze before walking out of the room. Behind her, Mr. Kim stood frozen, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of Arctic Nova's executive meeting room, casting sharp beams of light onto the polished mahogany table. Seated at the head was Franklin Yones, the CEO and owner of Arctic Nova. Despite his imposing figure and air of authority, his calm demeanor often left others guessing at his thoughts. Today, however, there was no mistaking the intensity in his gaze. The room was tense. Mr. Kim sat rigidly near the far end of the table, his usually polished exterior betrayed by the slight sheen of sweat on his brow. Samantha Spencer was seated to his left, her posture straight but her expression resolute. Across from her, the department coordinator, Mr. Hartman, flipped through notes, his brow furrowed with curiosity. Then the door opened, and Franklin Yones stepped in. He carried a folder under his arm, his movements unhurried but purposeful. For a moment, Mr. Kim's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Thank you all for coming," Arthur began, his voice steady. "We need to address the concerns raised after yesterday's investor presentation. I've received multiple complaints about vague and misleading claims. That's not how Arctic Nova operates." He turned to Mr. Kim. "You led the presentation. I'd like to hear your explanation." Mr. Kim straightened, clasping his hands together. "There were some last-minute adjustments to the draft," he said smoothly. "I made necessary changes to align with investor expectations. Bold claims drive interest, and that's what we need to stay competitive." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "And these adjustments, were they backed by testing data?" "Of course," Mr. Kim replied quickly, but his voice wavered slightly. "Our internal testing supports the 12-month shelf life and storage claims." "I see." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to Franklin. "Franklin, I understand you worked on this project before your departure. Do you have anything to add?" Franklin nodded, placing the folder on the table and opening it. "Yes, sir. The draft I submitted for review included rigorous testing data and accurate details. I'd like to share that version with the team." He handed a stack of papers to Arthur, who began scanning them. Samantha and Mr. Hartman leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. "The storage instructions in my draft were specific," Franklin explained. "It requires a temperature range of -18 degrees Celsius to -25 degrees Celsius to maintain quality. The 6-month shelf life was validated through extensive testing. These figures were backed by hard data. And this version," Arthur said, holding up the paper, "was altered." "Yes," Franklin said firmly. I have timestamps and document trails to prove it. He passed another sheet to Arthur. Here's the original draft I submitted, alongside the altered version presented yesterday. The changes include inflated claims that were never tested. Samantha spoke up, her voice steady. I saw the original draft, too. It was flawless. The changes weren't just risky, they were dishonest. Arthur's jaw tightened as he examined the documents. He turned to Mr. Hartman. Did you see this earlier version? Hartman nodded slowly. I did, and I remember it being far more precise than what was presented yesterday. These changes are troubling. All eyes turned to Mr. Kim, whose usual confidence had given way to a defensive edge. I was acting in the company's best interests, he said, his voice rising. Investors don't want technical jargon, they want bold, market-shaking ideas. I adjusted the presentation to match their expectations. Arthur's voice dropped, cold and deliberate. What they want, Mr. Kim, is the truth. What they don't want is to be lied to. Before Mr. Kim could respond, Samantha cleared her throat. There's something else I need to address, she said, turning to Arthur. I filed a formal harassment complaint this morning. Mr. Kim has repeatedly behaved inappropriately toward me, from dismissing my contributions to referring to me as Sammy in professional settings. And yesterday, he reduced my role to a prop. Arthur's gaze darkened. Is this true, Mr. Kim? Mr. Kim's face turned a deep shade of red. This is being blown out of proportion, he stammered. I've always treated my team professionally. That's not what I've experienced, Samantha countered, her voice unwavering. I've tolerated it for too long, but I won't stay silent anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur closed the folder and placed it deliberately on the table. Mr. Kim, you sabotaged your team's work, misled our investors, and created a hostile work environment. Your actions have jeopardized this company's reputation. I was doing what needed to be done, Mr. Kim protested, his voice rising in desperation. You can't fire me for trying to innovate. Arthur's tone turned steely. I can and I am. You're fired. Security will escort you out. For a moment, Mr. Kim sat frozen, as though he couldn't process what he had just heard. Then slowly he rose, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He stormed out without another word, leaving the room in tense silence. Arthur turned to Franklin and Samantha. His expression softened slightly. Franklin, I owe you an apology. You handled this situation with professionalism and integrity, even under difficult circumstances. Consider yourself reinstated, with a promotion. Thank you, sir, Franklin said, his voice calm but grateful. Arthur then addressed Samantha. Your courage in speaking up is commendable. Leadership isn't just about work, it's about standing for what's right. You've shown both. Samantha nodded. Thank you. Arthur stood, placing a hand on Franklin's shoulder. Let's rebuild investor trust and take this product to market the right way. Franklin and Samantha exchanged a glance as Arthur left the room, both feeling a sense of quiet triumph. For Franklin, justice had finally been served. And for Samantha, her voice had been heard. Franklin calmly gathered the papers from the table and headed toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned to Arthur with a light smile and a playful glint in his eye. Dad, if I manage to get the 12 months Mr. Kim promised, will you give me the company? Arthur, who had maintained a serious demeanor until that moment, let out an unexpected laugh. Do that, and we'll talk. Samantha, smiling from her seat, let out a quiet sigh of relief as Franklin left the room, having the final word and the satisfaction of setting things right. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'm sure you'll also love the next one. Click on the video on the screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you soon.